Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right in to clear up a pretty major misunderstanding in life science today, specifically looking at our bacteria and plants misconception check. You know, it's incredibly easy to look out your window, see a massive oak tree soaking up the sun and think, yep, I know exactly how that thing survives. We tend to view that tree as this totally independent, self-sufficient survivor, but the actual science? Well, it reveals a much more intricate, hidden reality about the dynamic relationship between bacteria and plants. So today, we're going to unpack exactly how that invisible relationship actually works. To make sure we really nail this, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the misconception itself, look at the evidence, map out a model of matter and energy, do a quick check on your understanding, and finally transfer your knowledge to a new scenario. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the misconception. So, tell me if this sounds familiar. Have you ever thought that plants are literally the only organisms capable of making their own food from sunlight? It's a super common assumption, right? I mean, we learned pretty early on that plants sit right at the base of the food web, just quietly soaking up rays and generating their own fuel. But this mental image leads to a massive misconception. We start thinking that plants exist completely on their own, operating as solitary little green factories in a total vacuum. We picture a lone plant doing absolutely all the heavy lifting to provide the foundation of energy for the entire planet, as if it doesn't need a single drop of help from its environment. And that brings us to the core myth here, the idea that only plants photosynthesize and they do it entirely alone. But the reality, the scientific reality, is that an ecosystem is incredibly dynamic, and the system involves so many organisms constantly interacting together. Plants are deeply, deeply dependent on their environment. And I'm not just talking about non-living stuff like weather and sunlight. We're talking about a vast, completely hidden network of other living things. There's literally a whole microscopic universe down in the soil and water, constantly interacting with those plants to keep the whole shebang running smoothly. Which brings us to Section 2, the evidence. Let's look at the exact wording from our science standards. It explicitly states that plants, algae, which includes phytoplankton, and many microorganisms use the energy from light to make sugars from carbon dioxide and water. Let that sink in for a second. It's not just plants pulling their weight here. Certain types of bacteria are out there acting as massive energy producers right alongside your everyday garden plants. In fact, phytoplankton, those tiny microscopic organisms just drifting out on our oceans, they're responsible for generating a huge chunk of the oxygen you and I breathe every single day. So that completely shatters the idea that land plants hold some sort of monopoly on making food from sunlight. Now, the technical definition here is photosynthesis, the process of using energy from light to make sugars, which act as food, from carbon dioxide and water, while releasing oxygen. But here's the kicker. Because microorganisms can do this too, it proves that creating food isn't just an exclusive plant club. Instead, it's a fundamental way that energy enters the entire biological system. Whether we're talking about a giant redwood tree or a microscopic bacterium floating in a puddle, they share that primary, vital role of capturing solar energy and transforming it into usable matter. All right, let's look at how this works in action with Section 3, Model, Matter, and Energy. So scientific principles show us that once this food is made, it doesn't just sit there waiting around. It gets put to work. Inside an organism, food moves through a really complex series of chemical reactions. I always like to think of these molecules like structures built out of Lego bricks. The organism takes those structures, breaks the Lego bricks apart, and then rearranges them into brand new molecular structures. And during this whole process, snapping bricks together, pulling them apart, energy is released, or it's used to fuel the organism's growth. And matter is perfectly conserved here. You aren't losing any Lego bricks. The atoms are just being rearranged through physical and chemical processes to build exactly what the organism needs to survive. Now, if we zoom out from a single organism, we can look at ecosystem matter cycling. This models how matter transfers between producers, consumers, and decomposers across a whole environment. And this is where other types of bacteria absolutely shine. Picture a dead leaf falling from a tree in autumn, landing on the forest floor. It doesn't just vanish, right? Decomposer bacteria go straight to work breaking down that dead plant matter. They act like a biological recycling center. Decomposers recycle nutrients back into the soil or water, meaning atoms cycle repeatedly between living and non-living parts of the ecosystem. Because of those bacteria, the nutrients from that dead leaf become the exact building blocks the tree needs to grow brand new leaves the following spring. Without bacteria acting as decomposers, plants would quickly run out of the recycled nutrients they literally need to survive. Let's pause for a quick second. Section 4. Check your understanding. Based on the ecosystem model we just reviewed,
What exactly happens to dead plant matter? Think back to what we just talked about. It's all about the essential role of decomposers. Those microorganisms are absolutely vital. They're doing the heavy lifting of chemical rearrangement, tearing apart the old structures to recycle the atoms right back into the environment. They make sure the soil or water is continuously prepped and loaded with the exact materials the next generation of producers needs to thrive.
And finally, let's wrap things up with Section 5, Transfer Your Knowledge. Let's apply this to a brand new scenario. How would a major disruption, like a severe lack of sunlight or the complete removal of decomposers, affect both the plants and the bacteria in this cycle? Well, scientific principles tell us that a disruption to any part of this system leads to massive shifts everywhere else. If you were to block out the sun, you wouldn't just starve the plants, you'd starve the photosynthesizing bacteria, and eventually the consumers and decomposers further down the line. On the flip side, if you remove the decomposer bacteria, the plants completely run out of recycled nutrients and eventually die off. They absolutely cannot exist in isolation. They rely on this deeply interconnected, dynamic flow of energy and matter. So the next time you look at a solitary houseplant sitting on a windowsill or a towering tree in the local park, ask yourself, what invisible, microscopic world is working overtime just to keep that single plant alive? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning how our natural world truly works.